Oi, pessoal, tô aqui com o Kowalski e olha só, a entrevista de hoje é uma homenagem à minha segunda pátria, a Itália, cuja Força Aérea, a Aeronáutica Militar Italiana, completa esse ano o seu centenário. E para falar desses 100 anos da aviação militar na Itália, vamos conversar com o jornalista e historiador Gregory Alegi, autor de mais de 50 livros e monografias sobre história aeronáutica e de documentários no cinema e na TV. Além de uma atuação na imprensa especializada, onde, por exemplo, é hoje coeditor do periódico Aeronáutica, o mais antigo e popular do setor na Itália, além de diversas outras ações. E como se não bastasse tudo isso, é ainda curador de coleções aeronáuticas, tendo participado da criação dos museus de aviação Volândia e Caprone. Então, com vocês, Gregory. Gregory, welcome to our channel. It is
Thank
an
you.
honor to have you here with us.
It is a great honor to be asked to do this interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Italy is one of the pioneer countries in aviation. The first effective military use of a plane is attributed to Italy in the war with Turkey in 1911. Could you tell us a little about this pioneering Italian protagonism?
Italy is an early participant in the development of military aviation. During the First World War, it builds about 12,000 airplanes, trains about 7,000 pilots. So it's, let's say, the first of the small nations, because Germany, Britain, and France roughly build 60,000 each. But Italy builds 3 times as many as its Austro-Hungarian opponent. So it gives you an idea of the relative strength. But what really is important, of course, is that the war allows to explore and define all the uses of aviation we think of today, whether it's fighters, it's bombers, it's reconnaissance, anti-submarine patrol, even some special operations, flying, let's say, individual operators behind enemy lines for sabotage and other things. So what becomes very clear as the war goes on is that the pilots, which are from the Army, the Navy, but also from other, let's say, military organizations, have more in common with each other as flyers than they do with their, let's say, original service. A lot of them start thinking in terms of aviation being able to produce effects on its own without necessarily being tied down to operations in the surface. They do this in different ways. In the Army, it's mostly Caproni bombers. The Navy sees it through airships, but the basic idea of the airplane going, the flying machine going very far, hitting behind enemy lines and so on, becomes fairly common. Also, an aviation industry is created. Nothing existed before the war. So as we reach the end of World War I, there is thinking, what is the next step? They're already thinking of creating an aviation service during the war. After the war, it becomes even more important because, of course, thankfully, we are in peace, but that means cutting budgets and the reorganizations. So the question becomes, do we end up having 2 small air forces inside the Army and Navy, or should we create an independent one? And this discussion goes on for about 4 years with basically 2 ideas. One idea is, let's copy the English. They created not just the RAF, but an air ministry. So they put all the eggs in the same basket, basically, and you're running everything. Or should we have, let's say, a merely technical organization which prepares pilots, which builds airplanes, and then turns them over to the Army and the Navy and said, you use them. That is basically the political debate. And eventually, they're about to solve this in the summer of 1922. Then there is, of course, Mussolini coming to power. And there's a lot of aviators who are on his side. But actually, Mussolini, yes, signs the decree which proclaims the Air Force as independent, but actually he doesn't make it into a really independent service. What happens? What happens is basically what we described before as Plan B. The actual Air Force prepares pilots, builds airplanes, and does all these things. But most of the operational use is still in the hands of the Army and the Navy. So it's one step forward, but it's not the final step. The final step will come about 10 years later when control comes really into the Air Force. But that is, it's an interesting period in which a lot of thinking, a lot of discussing, a lot of ideas are put forward. And it's something we're really only beginning to understand now, because the great anniversary of March 28th has always been a birthday. Now, let's say we're starting to look at how the parents met, how they fell in love, when they got married, not just when the child was born.
Interesting. But also in this interwar period, the country continued to stand out in aviation. There were several impressive raids, such as those led by Italo Balbo across the Atlantic. One of them came to Brazil.
Yes, in fact, the first 3 or 4 years of independence were rather chaotic, largely because you're trying to put together two different things. Army, which was about 90% of the organization, and Navy, which was about 10%. And you need to build airports because everything was up, let's say, near Venice, in the area in which the First World War had been fought. But there was very little in the rest of Italy where the war had not been fought. So there's a lot of challenges. And the difficulty is, at the same time, building something new, but also showing that you already exist. So these big, let's say, public demonstrations are meant to show that we already exist, already have a product. But in fact, they're building the product. They're building the airports, they're building the new airplanes, they're building the test centers, they're building everything. But the great events you mentioned are, let's say, indispensable to popularize aviation in the country. Just for one thing, why should young people want a career in the Air Force? Why should they not join the Navy or the Army? You need to give them something. And these great flights, first, many of them are individual, so records. And again, there's a famous one when Ferrarin and Del Prete reached Brazil in 1928. And they land in Touros after 7,200 kilometers of nonstop flying. Then 1930-31, the first mass transatlantic cruise from Orbetello in Tuscany to Rio de Janeiro, 12 airplanes, which are then sold to Brazil.
Yes.
And they actually even fought briefly in the Civil War. And of course, Brazil has the only original S-55, which, however, is a Brazilian one, a Jaú. Ribeiro do Barros and so on. So we're very envious that you have that beautiful airplane. And then the other great flight, 1933, from, again, Orbetello to Chicago, New York, and return. Now, why are these important? Yes, for propaganda and promotion, but because we're moving from single individual heroes like Lindbergh, the lonely eagle, we're going over to a group organization. These people were not necessarily exceptional pilots. They were professionals with exceptional training. They had trained for everything, including mountain survival. I said, what happens if you crash in Greenland? We'll teach you how to build an igloo and survive, which for 1933 was quite advanced. So these flights, apart from their public impression, are really the change from an era of individual heroes, of people who try, sometimes you succeed, sometimes not, and people who succeed because they have trained, because they have prepared. So that is really the birth of modern aviation.
Great, great. But then we got to World War II. For many, here in Brazil included, the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, was unprepared for war. Do you agree with this?
Yes, clearly the end results are very unsatisfactory. However, we have to go back a little bit and basically, throw out the history books we studied in high school and think, because we tend to study one thing after the other as separate conflicts, as separate wars. But Italy actually goes to war in 1935, invades Ethiopia, and fights there for a year, plus 3 years of counterinsurgency operations. It then goes to war in 36 in Spain for 3 years, and it does pretty well.
Yes.
However, and that is just on a purely, let's say, military performance. Of course, it doesn't include any ethical considerations, but just saying in terms of doing what you're asked to do.
Yeah. Right.
However, what's happening in those years? Well, 1935 flies the Messerschmitt 109, 1936 flies the Spitfire. The other countries are changing the nature of the airplane. They're throwing out wood, they're throwing out biplanes, and they're going over to modern all-metal monocoque construction and so on. Italy misses that train. They know that the world is changing, but they're fighting other wars. So when the Second World War breaks out, they're trying to catch the train they missed. And it proves impossible to do during the war. So that is really a major problem. In addition, some of the problems already existed before, like access to raw materials. Italy is an industrial country like Japan, but like Japan, without its own materials. It has to import them. In World War I, the materials came from, let's say, the Western world, from the Allies. In the Second World War, Italy is fighting against them. So it cannot get materials, it cannot get petrol, it cannot get anything it needs. So this time catching up proves very difficult. Also, there is issues of strategic management of the war, which basically are of a political nature. Mussolini seems to be more worried about competing with Hitler than of winning the war. So things like sending a contingent to Russia makes very little difference on the Russian front, but takes away a lot of precious resources back, for instance, in Africa. So the mix of these two means that despite the great commitment, the great heroism, the heavy losses of many airplanes and crews, their result is clearly very unhappy.
Yeah. But anyway, Italy had some very impressive aircraft in the war, such as the Piaggio 108 heavy bomber, and even the Macchi 205 and the Fiat G55 fighters. What did I think you already answered it, but I would like that you go a little ahead with these modern planes that Italy had, but they didn't change much.
Yes, the Macchi fighters from the 200 to the 202 to the 205 are really very much like the Spitfire. It's basically the same design, you just put a bigger engine in it and you get better performance. Also, the fact that the designer Castoldi had conceived the Schneider Trophy racers is the same as Mitchell having designed the British racers. And you can see how these people work the same way. They come from high-speed racers and they design fighters. And even if you go into the construction, I was fortunate to work on the restoration of both types. And inside, they're really similar in that the structures are complicated. You can see that the designers are thinking in wood, but then building in metal. It's a very interesting 1930s phenomenon. The Piaggio, instead, Casiraghi had worked in the United States, is a more modern concept in many ways. It even had remotely controlled turrets. But there's two important differences. One is that Piaggio isn't Boeing. So despite the talent of Casiraghi, there isn't the depth of engineering skill to look at the systems. Airplanes in those days are no longer, let's say, shapes, but they're systems. And that means you need a specialist in hydraulics, a specialist in armament, a specialist in electrical systems, and they don't have them. So a lot of the development is, let's say, more complicated than it should be. And also, the Piaggio is a good example of the problem of engines. While Italy has never had any lack of good mechanical or aerodynamical engineers and so on, engines have always been a difficult spot. In fact, if you look at it, very few airplanes have 100% Italian engines. And so as you need more power, there is a limit to how much you can derive from old designs. Basically, all the Alpha engines are derived from the Bristol Pegasus. And basically, all Piaggio engines come from the Gnome 14. That's basically where they come from. And there's only so much you can do to get a few more horsepower from a design. At some point, you need to throw it away and make a new one. But they just don't have the right engineers for that.
Okay. Well, since the war ended until today, Italy was very successful in maintaining its all aeronautical industry, capable of both generating original types and also taking part in multinational programs. Why and how, in your opinion?
Well, the first 10 years after World War II are very difficult because Italy was on the wrong side. So it really, until NATO is formed, Italy is outside the international community until 1949. And indeed, it only joins the United Nations in the mid-1950s. So you can see it's not as bad as Germany. There is no explicit prohibition on military aviation, but there are limitations. From the 1950s, however, a lot of new technology comes in and a lot of good designs, like the Fiat G91 family, which does an excellent work in the only war it is used for, with the Portuguese Air Force in Angola. The Portuguese loved it. I think it would have been a bit different against the Soviets in Central Europe, but that's another story. Or the most famous Brazilian aircraft, the Xavante, the Macchi 326 flies in 1957. So you can see that there is an ability to design, industrialize, support aircraft. The next step is the Starfighter, which is in fact the first step in what you were describing, Claudio, which is an international program. Because yes, it is a US design, but in fact, the G model is built by a consortium of European industries, and it ends up equipping Germany, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, and so on. So that is a big driver for common standards, interchangeability of parts, and so on. And then, of course, also having the same airplane means using it in the same way. So squadron exchanges, tactical exercise, and so on. The Starfighter is a massive step forward. And the next one is Tornado. Tornado, basically driven by the British and the Germans, with a significant Italian part, builds really on the F-104. It's an ambition to go beyond a US license and do something together. And it has proved a remarkably successful aircraft. In fact, the Italian Air Force is just phasing out the last ones. The last unit, Sixth Wing, Sesto Stormo, is just now, as we speak, transitioning to the F-35. So Tornado has had 36 years of service, including real operations, real war operations.
Yes. And well, how do you see the Italian military aviation today, including, as you told, the arrival of the 50th generation fighters?
Yes, it's an excellent question. What we mentioned before, real operations with Tornado. 1991, the Italian Air Force goes back to war after 46 years, okay, in the first Gulf War. And with a single Tornado squadron, which does well, all things considered. But let's say the post-operation review shows all the many things which could be improved. Just to give you one example, the lack of precision bombs. The idea that because as a platform, the Tornado is so precise, it gets right on the target, was assumed to mean that the bombs would hit the target, which they don't. So that's, we need that. Also, we need in-flight refueling. We need all sorts of things. And remarkably, for the past 30 years, a succession of chiefs of staff have held the same vision. They have learned to trade the quantity for quality. And so today, the Air Force is much smaller in numbers, but much higher in quality. F-35, it was the first European Air Force to declare operational capability, the first country in NATO to deploy the F-35 was to Iceland on air policing duties, the first country to fly an F-35 across the ocean.
Yes.
Before the Americans, because they had a technical problem, they had to scratch the participation in Farnborough, and the Italians got it first. With, again, an all-Italian package, Italian tanker, Italian chase, Italian oceanic rescue, the entire package. So today we have F-35, we have a Eurofighter, and we have what is probably the best C4 I-Star platform in service in Europe, the Gulfstream G550. And also, less glamorous, but very important, probably the most experienced UAV component. The Italian UAVs made their debut in Iraq in January 2005. We're now over 32 or 33,000 hours, including a large part of that on real operations. And so it is really a service which has finally decided to put the quality and the operations at the center of its existence. And now the next target is space. There is a very clear drive towards space operations in all their aspects. In every aspect, from space weather to space surveillance to an autonomous launching capability. All these aspects are understood to be a natural extension of the air domain, up to 100 kilometers for now.
Great. So, what do you consider to be the great legacy of these 100 years of the Italian Air Force?
Well, it is a legacy of service and duty to the country. Always there doing what you're asked to do. In recent years, I would say also with a more critical thinking, not just obeying orders, but also saying, look, in the interest of the country, we need this more than that. I think that that is the great shift after 1990, is a greater clarity and saying that it's not just obeying orders, but try to explain what we're here for and what we're doing. And I think that that is a very, very important thing. Also trying to shape the future, not just be a subject of somebody else's future. It was a big event last month here in Rome, a big conference organized by the Italian Air Force, which was discussing precisely what we will need in the future as air forces, as, let's say, operators not on the surface, and with representatives from, I think, 47 countries and so on. We had, I think, 20 chiefs of staff. And that was a great honor. They asked me to be one of the panelists on that. And it was interesting to see a country which is thinking, not just translating somebody else's manuals. I think that is the great progress. Of course, sometimes you get things wrong, but it's better to be wrong on your own than to be just translating somebody else's thinking.
Yes, yes. So thank you a lot, Gregory, for this wonderful interview. I hope it would be the first of more times to talk with you here.
Thank you, Claudio.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much. It was a great honor, a great pleasure, and because Brazil always has a special place in the heart for all Italians. So it's a great honor, and thank you for being interested in the Italian Air Force's 100th anniversary.